Close your eyes. Imagine a river, the longest river in the world, a river so ancient that the civilization it nourished was already old when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 hills. A river that flooded every year with such reliability, such generous precision, that the people who lived along its banks built one of the most enduring civilizations in human history on the certainty of that annual gift. The Nile, and on its banks a city. Alexandria, built by Alexander the Great on the coast of the Mediterranean, where the Nile meets the sea. A city of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary knowledge, home to the greatest library the ancient world would ever know, to scholars and philosophers and scientists from across the Mediterranean, to a lighthouse so tall and so magnificent that it was counted among the 7 wonders of the world. The air is warm. It is always warm here at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where the desert meets the sea. The smell of salt water and of exotic spice, of papyrus and cedar wood, and the particular dry warmth of a city that sits at the edge of the largest desert on earth. This is Egypt. And tonight we are here for a woman whose name has been spoken continuously for 2,000 years, in histories and plays and poems and paintings and films, in languages she never heard, by people she never imagined. A woman whose story has been told so many times that the legend has almost completely buried the human being underneath. Tonight we try to find the human being. Cleopatra vii Philipata, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last ruler of the dynasty that Alexander's general Ptolemy had founded 3 centuries before her birth, the last person to read the hieroglyphics of the ancient Egyptian priests, the woman who captivated the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world, not, as her legend often implies, through the supernatural force of her beauty, but through something far more interesting and far more rare. Her mind. Her extraordinary, formidable, relentlessly capable mind. This is a story of power and love and war and grief, of a woman who spent her entire adult life fighting for a kingdom that was being slowly devoured by Rome, fighting with every tool available to her, never surrendering, never accepting the diminishment that everyone around her expected her to accept. And of what happened when, finally, she ran out of tools. So settle in, let the warm Egyptian night settle around you, let the river flow. And let history carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The world Cleopatra was born into. To understand Cleopatra, you first need to understand the Egypt she inherited. By the time of her birth in 69 BC, Egypt was one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. The pyramids at Giza had already been standing for 2,500 years, as ancient to Cleopatra as Cleopatra is to us. The hieroglyphic writing system, the elaborate rituals of the pharaonic religion, the mythology of Isis and Osiris and Horus and Ra, all of it stretched back into a past so deep that even the Egyptians themselves had lost track of where it began. And yet the dynasty that ruled this ancient land was, in origin, not Egyptian at all. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, young, sudden, without a clear heir, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to a Macedonian Greek named Ptolemy, who had been one of Alexander's closest companions and most trusted officers. Ptolemy was a practical man of genius. He understood that to rule Egypt effectively he needed the legitimacy that only the Egyptian religious tradition could provide. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror but as the successor to the pharaohs. He built temples in the Egyptian style, supported the Egyptian priesthood, took on the divine attributes of the pharaonic tradition. His descendants did the same. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt in this dual identity, Greek in their personal culture, speaking Greek at court, producing Greek literature and philosophy, but presenting themselves to their Egyptian subjects as legitimate pharaohs, children of the gods, heirs to the oldest throne in the world. The result was a culture of extraordinary richness and extraordinary tension. Alexandria, the capital they built on the Mediterranean coast, was the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of written knowledge in antiquity, attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean. The city's population was a mixture of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other communities, all living in proximity, all contributing to a culture that was genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that few ancient cities achieved. But underneath the splendor, the Ptolemaic dynasty was in serious trouble by the time Cleopatra was born. The dynasty had a weakness that appeared with terrible regularity across its 3-century history. It ate itself. Ptolemaic rulers murdered their siblings, their parents, their children, with a frequency and a casual brutality that makes the history of the dynasty read like a particularly dark family drama. Brothers killed brothers, sisters killed sisters, children conspired against parents, parents eliminated children before they could conspire. This was not mere wickedness, it was the logic of absolute power in a world without secure succession law. Every royal sibling was a potential rival. Every cousin was a potential claimant. The safest thing to do with a rival was to eliminate them before they could eliminate you. Cleopatra was born into this world. She grew up understanding from the earliest age that the people closest to her were also the people most likely to kill her. It made her formidable. It also made her, in certain ways, permanently alone. Part 2. The father. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy Xii, known to history, somewhat unkindly, as Ptolemy Auletes, the flute player. He was not a great king. He was not even a particularly good one. He was a man of moderate ability placed in an impossible situation, ruling a kingdom that was losing its independence to Rome with the slow inevitability of a sandcastle dissolving at high tide. Rome had been expanding its power across the Mediterranean for 2 centuries by the time of Ptolemy Xii's reign. Egypt was the last great independent kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean. It was also, by far, the wealthiest. The grain surplus of the Nile Valley fed the Roman Empire, and whoever controlled Egypt controlled the food supply of the most powerful state in the ancient world. Rome had not yet absorbed Egypt, but the pressure was constant and growing. Roman creditors had enormous influence in Alexandria. Roman political decisions shaped Egyptian policy. Egypt existed in the uncomfortable position of a very rich, very tempting prize that had not yet been claimed. Ptolemy Xii responded to this pressure with a strategy of desperate appeasement. He cultivated Roman patrons at enormous expense. He borrowed vast sums of money from Roman bankers to pay bribes to Roman politicians. He accepted Roman oversight of his kingdom's finances to service those debts. His own people despised him for it. In 58 BC, when he was away in Rome seeking support, the Alexandrians rose and expelled him. He spent years in exile, lobbying Roman politicians for restoration. He eventually succeeded by promising the Roman general Gabinius an enormous sum of money to restore him to his throne by military force. The Gabiniani, the Roman soldiers who came with Gabinius, remained in Alexandria as an occupying garrison after Ptolemy Xii was restored. Egypt was, in everything but name, a Roman client state. Ptolemy Xii died in 51 BC, leaving his kingdom to 2 of his children, his daughter Cleopatra, who was about 18 years old, and his younger son Ptolemy Xii, who was about 10. They were supposed to rule together, as husband and wife, following the Ptolemaic tradition of sibling marriage that the Greeks found barbaric and the Egyptians considered sacred. Cleopatra was now a queen, and she was surrounded by people who wanted to destroy her. Part 3. The Young Queen. Cleopatra was, from the very first moments of her reign, exceptional. She was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in nearly 300 years to learn the Egyptian language. Think about that for a moment. 3 centuries of rulers presenting themselves as pharaohs, performing the rituals of the Egyptian religion, claiming to be the children of Egyptian gods, and not one of them had bothered to learn the language of the people they ruled. Cleopatra learned it, and not just Egyptian, she learned 9 languages in total according to the ancient sources: Aramaic, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, the languages of the various peoples who traded with and lived within her kingdom. She used them not as an accomplishment but as a tool, speaking directly to people in their own language, without interpreters, creating a connection that her predecessors had never attempted. The ancient sources describe her voice as extraordinarily compelling, not just her words but the quality of her speech, the music of it, the way she could make the person she was talking to feel as though they were the only person in the world worth speaking to. Plutarch, writing about her generations later, says that her beauty was not in itself so remarkable, but that the charm of her conversation and the intelligence of everything she said was irresistible. She was also deeply educated in the tradition of Hellenistic scholarship. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, rhetoric. She moved through the intellectual world of Alexandria with the ease of someone who had grown up in its greatest library. And she was politically acute in ways that went far beyond what her age and her inexperience might have suggested. She understood from the beginning that Egypt's survival depended on managing Rome, that the question was not whether Rome would eventually control Egypt, it would, but whether Egypt could maintain enough independence, enough dignity, enough of its own power to remain something more than a Roman province. She spent her entire reign trying to answer that question. Part 4: The First Fall. The early years of Cleopatra's reign were turbulent. Her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, her nominal co-ruler and nominal husband, was 10 years old when they came to the throne. He was managed by a group of court advisors who had their own ambitions and who saw the young boy as a far more controllable instrument of power than his formidable older sister. The chief of these advisors was a eunuch named Pothinus, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable ruthlessness, who understood that as long as Cleopatra was in power, his own influence would always be limited. Pothinus moved against her. He cultivated the support of the Alexandrian court. He built a faction around the young king, and by 49 BC, just 2 years into her reign, Cleopatra was forced out of Egypt. She went to the border region between Egypt and Syria and began assembling an army. She was not going to accept exile quietly. She was going to fight her way back. At which point history intervened in the form of a Roman civil war. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in northern Italy, defying the Senate, breaking Roman law, triggering the war between himself and Pompey that would determine the future of the Roman world. Caesar marched on Rome. Pompey fled to Greece. In 48 BC, Caesar defeated Pompey's forces at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary. The court of Ptolemy XIII, advised by Pothinus and his colleagues, made a calculation. Pompey was finished. Caesar had won. The way to curry favor with Caesar was to eliminate his enemy. As Pompey's boat approached the shore of Egypt, he was stabbed to death in a small rowing boat within sight of the coast by men he had believed were coming to welcome him. His head was cut off and preserved to present to Caesar. Days later, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He was not pleased by the gift he was given. Part 5: Caesar. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC as the most powerful man in the Roman world. He was 52 years old. He had just won a civil war. He was at the absolute height of his power and his reputation. He came to Alexandria ostensibly to collect a debt. Ptolemy XII had borrowed an enormous sum from Rome, and Caesar had come to collect what was owed. He also came as the avenger of Pompey, furious, by all accounts genuinely furious, at the manner of his rival's death. He took up residence in the royal palace, and immediately became embroiled in the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother. Cleopatra was outside Alexandria with an army. She could not simply walk into the city. The forces of Ptolemy XIII controlled it, and she would have been killed before she reached the palace gates. What she did instead has become one of the most celebrated pieces of political theater in history. She had herself smuggled into the palace rolled inside a carpet, or possibly a sack for bedclothes. The sources are not entirely consistent, carried by a single Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus. The carpet was unrolled in front of Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra stood up. What happened in the hours that followed is not recorded by any source that was actually present. We know that by the next morning, Cleopatra and Caesar were allies. We know that within a short time they were lovers. What was said between them in those first hours, what arguments she made, what impression she created, how the most powerful man in the Roman world was persuaded to support the exiled queen against her brother and his advisors, we do not know. What we know is the result. Caesar supported Cleopatra. Part 6. The Alexandrian War. The decision of Caesar to support Cleopatra against Ptolemy XIII triggered a crisis that nearly killed him. Pothinus, the advisor who had managed the expulsion of Cleopatra and the murder of Pompey, understood that Caesar's support of Cleopatra meant the end of his own influence and possibly his own life. He moved quickly. The Alexandrian mob was incited against the Romans. The Gabiniani soldiers, the Roman garrison that had been left behind after Ptolemy XII's restoration, joined the Egyptian forces. The young king's general Achilles arrived with an army of 20,000 soldiers. Caesar found himself besieged in the royal palace with a small force, in a hostile city, with his supply lines cut off. The Alexandrian War, the series of street battles and naval engagements that followed, was one of the most dangerous episodes of Caesar's career. His forces were significantly outnumbered. He was fighting in unfamiliar urban terrain. His supply of reinforcements was uncertain. During the fighting, part of the great library of Alexandria caught fire. Whether from Caesar's naval actions or from some other cause, the ancient sources disagree. It is one of history's enduring tragedies, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, damaged or destroyed in the margins of a war that was fundamentally about Roman politics. Caesar held on. Reinforcements eventually arrived. The Egyptian forces were defeated. Ptolemy XIII fled and drowned in the Nile, weighted down, it was said, by his golden armor. Pothinus had already been executed on Caesar's orders. Cleopatra was queen of Egypt again. She was 21 years old. Part 7. The Nile Journey. With the immediate crisis resolved, Caesar spent several more months in Egypt, far longer than any military or political necessity required. He and Cleopatra sailed up the Nile together. Think about what that journey must have been like. A flotilla of royal barges moving slowly upriver through the Egyptian landscape, the narrow green strip of cultivated land along the river's banks, the desert rising on both sides to the horizon, the ancient temples and monuments passing slowly by, temples that were already thousands of years old, the civilization of the pharaohs stretching back into time so deep that even Caesar, who had conquered Gaul and won a civil war, must have felt the weight of it. Cleopatra would have been his guide to all of it. She knew this world, its history, its religion, its language, in ways that no one else could have shown it to him. She was not merely the object of his interest. She was the person who made the world they were traveling through intelligible. Their relationship was not, despite the way it is sometimes portrayed, simply a matter of a powerful man and a beautiful woman. Cleopatra was Caesar's intellectual equal. She was a ruler of comparable skill and ambition. The attraction between them was, by all indications, as much a meeting of minds as a physical connection. Before Caesar left Egypt, Cleopatra was pregnant with his child. She gave birth to a son whom she named Ptolemy Caesar. The Alexandrians called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was, she always maintained, Caesar's son, the heir to both the Roman world and the Egyptian throne, the living embodiment of the alliance between Rome and Egypt that she was trying to build. Caesar acknowledged the boy quietly, without ever making the acknowledgement official in the Roman legal sense. Under Roman law, Caesarion was not his heir. He had a Roman wife. He had Roman political considerations. But he never denied it either. Cleopatra raised her son as the future of everything she was fighting for. Part 8. Rome. In 46 BC, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She came, she brought Caesarion, who was perhaps 2 years old. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, not in the city itself, because the presence of a foreign queen in Rome proper would have been politically provocative, but close enough to be part of the social and political life of the capital. Rome was fascinated and disturbed by her in equal measure. The Romans had complicated feelings about Egypt. They were drawn to its ancient culture, its exotic luxury, its philosophy and art. Egyptian religion, particularly the cult of Isis, had spread widely through the Roman world. Egyptian goods were prized. Egyptian scholarship was respected. But they were also deeply suspicious of the East, of its luxury and its decadence, of the ways in which Eastern cultures seemed to them to threaten the stern Roman virtues of simplicity, discipline, and republican sobriety. Cleopatra embodied both sides of this ambivalence. She was fascinating and threatening simultaneously. Caesar's enemies used her presence as evidence of his corruption. Here was a man so besotted with a foreign queen that he was bringing her to Rome, displaying her openly, humiliating his Roman wife. There were rumors that he intended to make himself king, forbidden under Roman law and Roman tradition, and to take Cleopatra as his queen. Whether those rumors were true, we cannot know. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC, before his intentions became clear. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened. She fled back to Egypt almost immediately. She was 25 years old, she had lost her most powerful protector, and the Roman world was about to tear itself apart in another civil war. Part 9, The Interlude. The years between Caesar's assassination in 44 BC and Cleopatra's meeting with Mark Antony in 41 BC were a period of waiting and of consolidation. She returned to Egypt and resumed sole rule, eliminating her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who had been her nominal co-ruler, probably by poison. She was not going to make the same mistake twice. She had seen what happened when you left a potential rival alive. She ruled Egypt with considerable skill during these years. She managed the economy carefully. She maintained the loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood by supporting their temples and their rituals. She cultivated the image of Isis, the great mother goddess of Egypt, the divine protector, the queen of heaven, that she had been building throughout her reign. The identification of Cleopatra with Isis was not merely decorative. It was a deliberate political and religious strategy. The goddess Isis was the most widely worshipped deity in the ancient Mediterranean. Her cult had spread from Egypt across the entire Roman world. By presenting herself as Isis incarnate, Cleopatra was claiming not just the legitimacy of the Egyptian religious tradition, but a divine authority that transcended national boundaries. She appeared in public dressed as Isis, in the goddess's distinctive robes and headdress. She was depicted in temples and on coins as Isis. When she received petitions from her subjects, she received them as the goddess receiving her children. It was genius of a particular kind, the genius of someone who understood that religion is power, and that a queen who is also a goddess commands a different kind of obedience than a queen who is merely human. Caesarion grew. She raised him carefully, educated him in the tradition of Hellenistic scholarship, prepared him for the role she intended him to play. And she watched Rome. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world divided between his enemies, led by the Republicans Brutus and Cassius, and his supporters, principally his lieutenant Mark Antony and his adopted son Octavian. The two sides fought. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius, who both committed suicide. The Roman world was now divided between Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. Cleopatra's next protector had identified himself. Part 10, Antony. Mark Antony was, in almost every way, the opposite of Julius Caesar. Where Caesar was controlled, calculating, precise, a man who managed his image with the care of an artist, Antony was extravagant, impulsive, generous to excess, capable of the most extraordinary courage and the most spectacular misjudgment, often in the same week. He was enormously physically impressive, tall, powerfully built, with what the ancient sources describe as a face reminiscent of the statues of Hercules. He cultivated this connection deliberately, claiming descent from Hercules and playing the role of the great hero with considerable theatrical flair. He was also, by all accounts, genuinely charming, warm, accessible, generous with his time and his resources, the kind of leader that soldiers and common people adored and that aristocrats found alarming. He drank heavily, he spent extravagantly, he made political decisions with his heart rather than his head with a frequency that dismayed his advisors. And in 41 BC, he summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in what is now Turkey, to answer charges that Egypt had provided support to his enemies during the recent civil war. It was a summons. He expected her to come to him. He expected her to be nervous, to be apologetic, to be eager to please the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman world. She was none of these things. Part 11. The Meeting at Tarsus. Cleopatra's arrival at Tarsus is one of the most celebrated moments in ancient history and one of the most carefully staged. She sailed up the river Cydnus on a barge of extraordinary opulence. The sails were purple, the color of royalty. The oars were silver, beaten to catch the light. The deck was covered with flowers whose perfume drifted across the water to the riverbanks where crowds had gathered to watch. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, the Greek equivalent of Isis, the divine power that civilized the world. Beautiful slave boys stood on either side of her, dressed as cupids, fanning her. Her serving women were dressed as sea nymphs. Plutarch, describing the scene, writes that the city of Tarsus had emptied to watch. Even Antony, waiting for her on his official tribunal, was left sitting almost alone as his own people went to the river to see the queen arrive. She invited him to dinner on the barge. He came. What she provided that night was, by the ancient accounts, extraordinary, not just in the luxury and beauty of the setting, which was remarkable enough, but in the quality of the conversation, the wit, the intelligence, the sense that here was a person who was genuinely interesting, genuinely formidable, genuinely worthy of a great man's full attention. He invited her to dinner the next night. She accepted on the condition that he come to her, a reversal of the expected power dynamic that was entirely deliberate. Within days, Mark Antony was in love. Or something that functioned like love, a deep, consuming attachment that would last the rest of his life and shape the history of the Roman world. He followed her back to Alexandria. He spent the winter there. He spent it in a state of enjoyment and relaxation that the ancient sources describe with a mixture of admiration and horror: banquets, parties, philosophical discussions, drinking games, wandering the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise to observe ordinary life. He and Cleopatra called their social circle the inimitable livers, the society of those who live without equal. It was a joke, a piece of royal self-mockery, but it was also a genuine expression of their shared appetite for experience, for pleasure, for the fullness of life. He was, by all indications, happier in Alexandria than he had ever been anywhere else. Part 12. The Partnership. The relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was not simply a love affair, though it was certainly that. It was a political partnership of mutual necessity that happened to also be a profound personal connection. Cleopatra needed Antony because Egypt needed Rome. More specifically, it needed a powerful Roman patron who would protect Egypt's independence against the growing power of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who was consolidating control of the Western Roman world with a cold efficiency that made him increasingly dangerous. Antony needed Cleopatra because his campaigns in the east required the resources of Egypt. The wealth of the Nile Valley, the grain, the gold, the administrative capacity of the most sophisticated state in the ancient Mediterranean was essential to his military ambitions. They married in the Egyptian manner, not the Roman legal form, which would have been politically impossible for Antony, who had a Roman wife. But the marriage was real in every other sense. They had 3 children together, twins, a boy and a girl, born in 40 BC, and a younger son. Antony made a series of gifts of territory to Cleopatra that were extraordinary in their scale: Cyprus, parts of the Levantan coast, portions of Cyrene in North Africa. He was effectively restoring to Egypt something of the territory it had held in earlier centuries, rebuilding the Ptolemaic Empire that had been slowly dismantled by Rome. In return, Cleopatra funded his military campaigns. She provided ships, grain, money, the logistical infrastructure that his ambitions required. The donations of Alexandria, a ceremony in 34 BC in which Antony formally proclaimed Cleopatra as Queen of Kings and Caesarion as King of Kings, dividing the Eastern world between their children, was the culmination of this partnership. It was also, in Rome, the beginning of the end. Part 13. Octavian. While Antony and Cleopatra were building their Eastern Empire, a young man in Rome was watching. Octavian, the man who would eventually become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was in many ways the most remarkable politician in Roman history. He was not physically impressive. He was slight, often ill, lacking the military charisma of Caesar or Antony. He was not a great general in the field, he suffered from seasickness, he was prone to illness at crucial moments, he relied on his great general Agrippa to actually win his battles. But he was a political genius of a completely different order. He was patient where Antony was impulsive. He was calculating where Antony was emotional. He was an extraordinary propagandist, capable of shaping public perception with an efficiency that the modern world would recognize and admire. And he understood with perfect clarity that the key to defeating Antony was Cleopatra. He could not attack Antony directly on purely political grounds. Antony was a legitimate Roman leader with enormous support among the Eastern legions, but he could attack Antony through his Egyptian queen. He could portray Antony not as a rival Roman leader but as a man who had gone native, who had abandoned Roman values, Roman religion, Roman sobriety, who was the puppet of a foreign queen who wanted to rule the Roman world from Alexandria. He launched a propaganda campaign against Cleopatra of extraordinary viciousness and extraordinary effectiveness. She was the Eastern queen, luxurious, decadent, sexually voracious, using her supernatural powers over men to subvert Rome's greatest generals. She was Isis worshipped as a goddess, which was blasphemy. She was planning to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria. She was going to destroy everything Rome had built. Almost none of it was true, but it worked. The Roman Senate, inflamed by Octavian's propaganda, declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a legal fiction of considerable cleverness. By declaring war on Egypt rather than on Antony, Octavian avoided the accusation of civil war while achieving the same effect. Part 14. The Campaign. The war between Octavian and the alliance of Antony and Cleopatra came to its decisive moment at the Battle of Actium in September 31 BC. Actium is a promontory on the western coast of Greece, where Antony and Cleopatra had established their main camp. Their fleet was anchored in the Gulf of Ambracia behind it. Octavian's forces, commanded by Agrippa, had been systematically cutting off their supply lines for months. The situation inside the camp was deteriorating. Disease was spreading through the army, supplies were running low, Antony's soldiers were demoralized, defections to Octavian were increasing, including, devastatingly, several of Antony's most senior commanders. The battle itself, fought on September 2, 31 BC, is still debated by historians. The ancient sources are contradictory and partisan. What we know is the outcome. During the naval engagement, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships broke through the battle lines and sailed south. Whether this was a planned retreat, a decision made in advance to preserve the Egyptian fleet and its treasury for a later campaign, or a sudden loss of nerve, we cannot say with certainty. Antony, seeing her sails, followed. He abandoned his army, his fleet, the battle. His forces, leaderless, eventually surrendered. The Battle of Actium was over, Octavian had won. What happened between Antony and Cleopatra in the days immediately following Actium, the recriminations, the despair, the desperate attempts to find some path forward, the sources give us only fragments. They sailed back to Alexandria, they tried to negotiate with Octavian. Cleopatra sent envoys with gifts and concessions, Antony sent letters. Octavian was not interested in negotiation, he was interested in total victory. Part 15. The End of Antony. Octavian advanced on Egypt with his army. Antony's forces, what remained of them, made one final effort. There was a brief engagement outside Alexandria in which, for a moment, the outcome seemed uncertain. And then Antony's cavalry went over to Octavian. The ancient sources say that Antony believed Cleopatra had betrayed him, had negotiated some private arrangement with Octavian. Whether this was true, or a rumor spread by her enemies, or a misunderstanding in the chaos of defeat, we do not know. What we know is that Antony received a message, false, as it turned out, that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. He lingered, in agony, until word reached him that Cleopatra was alive. She had retreated to a mausoleum she had built, where she had gathered her treasures and barricaded herself in, refusing to be taken. He was carried to her, lifted through a window of the barricaded mausoleum, because she would not open the doors for fear of Octavian's soldiers. He died in her arms. He was 53 years old. Part 16, Cleopatra and Octavian. Octavian took Alexandria without significant resistance. He treated the city with more care than his propaganda might have suggested. He was far too politically sophisticated to allow the sack of Alexandria, which would have alienated the educated Mediterranean world and destroyed the economic asset he had just won. He wanted Cleopatra, not because he felt anything for her. Octavian was not a man of strong personal passions. Everything in him was subordinated to political calculation. He wanted Cleopatra because he needed her for his triumph. The Roman triumph, the formal celebration of a military victory, in which the victorious general paraded through the streets of Rome followed by the spoils of his campaign, was one of the great rituals of Roman life, and the most prized element of any triumph was the captive enemy leader, displayed in chains before the cheering Roman crowd. Cleopatra understood this with perfect clarity. She knew exactly what fate Octavian intended for her. She had heard what had happened to Vercingetorix after Caesar's triumph, held in a Roman prison for years, displayed at the triumph, then quietly executed. She had no intention of walking in chains through the streets of Rome. She met with Octavian in person. The ancient sources describe a meeting of extraordinary tension, Cleopatra trying to work whatever charm or political magic had worked with Caesar, and with Antony, Octavian cold and polite and completely unmoved. He was 22 years younger than Caesar had been when he met her, and he had spent years inoculating himself against exactly this kind of manipulation. He assured her that she would be treated with respect and dignity. She did not believe him. Part 17, The Death of Cleopatra. Cleopatra died on August 12, 30 BC. She was 39 years old. The method of her death is one of history's most famous mysteries. The most celebrated account, the asp, the small Egyptian cobra brought to her in a basket of figs, is almost certainly legend rather than history. The ancient sources themselves are inconsistent. Some say she used a snake, some say she used a pin dipped in poison, some say she had poison concealed in her hair combs. What the sources agree on is that she prepared her death with the same care and deliberateness she had brought to everything she did. She bathed, she dressed in her finest robes, she put on her diadem, the crown of the pharaohs. She arranged herself on her golden couch in a pose of regal composure. She wrote a letter to Octavian asking to be buried beside Mark Antony, then sealed it and sent it. When Octavian received the letter and understood what it meant, that she had already done it, that she had chosen death over his triumph, he sent men immediately. They were too late. They found her dead. 2 of her serving women were dead or dying beside her. Octavian was said to be furious. He had wanted her alive. He had lost his greatest prize. He allowed her to be buried beside Antony, as she had asked. He had Caesarion, her son by Caesar, the boy who was 17 years old and the last legitimate heir of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and of Julius Caesar, killed. He could not afford to leave that claim alive. Egypt became a Roman province. The last great independent kingdom of the ancient Mediterranean was absorbed into the empire that would rule the world for the next 4 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty, 3 centuries of Greek pharaohs, of extraordinary cultural achievement and extraordinary dynastic violence, was over. The last person who could read the hieroglyphics of the ancient Egyptian priestly tradition died with Cleopatra. Within a generation, the knowledge of how to read them was lost, not recovered until the Rosetta Stone was deciphered in the 19th century, 2,000 years later. Part 18, The Legend and the Woman. For 2,000 years, the legend of Cleopatra has obscured the woman. She has been the femme fatale, the seductress who used her beauty and her sexuality to manipulate great men, the Eastern queen whose luxurious decadence corrupted Rome's finest soldiers, the cautionary tale of what happens when a woman has too much power, when Eastern excess overwhelms Western virtue. This is Octavian's version, the propaganda of the man who destroyed her, preserved and amplified across 2 millennia. The reality was different. Cleopatra was not primarily a seductress, she was a ruler. She governed Egypt for 21 years, from the age of 18 to the age of 39. In those 21 years, she managed an economy, maintained an army, supported a religious establishment, negotiated with Rome, and preserved Egyptian independence against the most powerful empire in the ancient world for longer than anyone had any right to expect. She did not seduce Caesar. She convinced him with argument, with intelligence, with a clear presentation of mutual interests, that supporting her was in his interest. She did the same with Antony. The relationships were real. The love was real as far as we can tell. But the relationships were also embedded in a matrix of political calculation that was entirely conscious and entirely rational. She was, as the historian Stacey Skiff has written, perhaps the most capable ruler of her age, and the one whose reputation has suffered most from the bias of the sources we rely on, which were almost entirely written by her enemies or by people who had absorbed her enemies' version of events. She died because she ran out of options, not because she was a woman whose emotions overwhelmed her political judgment. The suicide was a political act, the final assertion of control over her own fate in a situation where control had been taken from her. She refused to walk in chains through Rome. That refusal, in its own way, was the most pharaonic thing she ever did. Part 19. What she left behind. Egypt survived her death by 2,000 years and is surviving still. The Nile still floods, or would flood, before the Aswan Dam was built. The pyramids still stand. The temples that Cleopatra supported and beautified are still visited by millions of people every year. Her image has never stopped circulating. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, she is given some of the most beautiful lines in the English language. In modern films, she has been portrayed by actresses of extraordinary talent and extraordinary beauty. In popular culture, she is one of the handful of figures from the ancient world whose name is instantly recognizable to people who know nothing else about ancient history. The story has lasted because it contains things that last: love and power and ambition and loss. A woman fighting against impossible odds with every tool available to her. Two of history's greatest men undone, at least in part, by their connection to her. And the particular poignancy of the ending: a woman who had ruled a kingdom, who had captivated Caesar and Antony, who had maintained Egyptian independence for 21 years, dying alone on a golden couch in a locked mausoleum, dressed as a goddess, refusing the last indignity that her conqueror intended for her. There is a kind of victory in that ending, if you look at it the right way. She chose it on her own terms, in her own time, as herself. The last pharaoh of Egypt. Isis on earth. Cleopatra. Closing the Nile 80 night. And so her story comes to rest. 39 years, from the palace in Alexandria where she was born into a dynasty of brilliant, violent, doomed rulers, to the locked mausoleum where she chose to end it on her own terms. She was a linguist and a scholar and a politician and a naval commander and a lover and a mother and a goddess and a queen. She was, above all, a woman who refused to accept the small, diminished role that her world and her enemies tried to force on her, and who spent her entire life expanding the space available to her through intelligence and will and the sheer refusal to give up. Let the images settle now, like sand on the bed of the Nile. The young girl studying languages in the great library of Alexandria, the queen stepping out of a rolled carpet in front of Julius Caesar, the golden barge sailing up the Cydnus River, the smell of flowers drifting across the water, the twins born in Alexandria named for the sun and the moon, the ceremony in which she was declared Queen of Kings, the locked mausoleum, the golden couch, the diadem. Let those images grow quiet. The Nile is still flowing tonight. It has been flowing for millions of years. It will flow long after every name in this story has been forgotten. But for now, the name is remembered. Cleopatra. There is nothing left to fight for tonight. No kingdoms to hold, no Romans to manage, no empires to build. Only the warm Egyptian dark. And the river. And sleep. Soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.